My name is Harper, and 6 months ago my life unraveled over a simple dinner conversation. Here I am now, sitting in my cottage with Luna purring on my lap. Sometimes the worst betrayals come wrapped in ordinary moments. It all started on a Tuesday evening in March. James had just received his first monthly salary from Morrison & Associates. £12,000. More money than we'd ever seen in one go. I'd spent the afternoon preparing his favorite meal, shepherd's pie with extra cheese, just the way his grandmother used to make it. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and thyme. I'd even opened wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. I was naive to think we'd celebrate together. That this windfall might ease the financial pressure weighing on our marriage. James had been unemployed for 8 months after his company went under. We'd survived on my charity shop earnings. It hadn't been easy, but I thought we'd weathered the storm together. The first warning came when Margaret arrived. Just as I was setting the table. James's mother had our spare key and used it liberally. She swept into our small dining room carrying champagne and wearing that particular smile I'd learned to dread. "Darling boy," she cooed, embracing James whilst completely ignoring me. "I simply had to celebrate your triumph. You've worked so terribly hard for this opportunity." No mention of the months I'd supported us both. Or how I'd encouraged James through every rejection letter. Margaret had her own version of recent history. In her eyes, I was the woman who'd somehow trapped her precious son. "Mum, you didn't need to bring anything," James said. His face lit up in a way it rarely did when he looked at me anymore. "Harper's prepared dinner." "How thoughtful," Margaret replied. Her tone made thoughtful sound like an insult. She surveyed my carefully set table like someone examining a disappointing school project. As we sat down, I tried steering conversation towards our future. With James's salary, we could finally save for a house deposit. Perhaps plan the honeymoon we'd never afforded. But every time I spoke, Margaret interrupted with James's childhood achievements or career advice. "You know, darling," she said, cutting delicately into her pie, "now that you're earning properly, you must be careful with finances. A man in your position has responsibilities." Ice settled in my stomach. The way she emphasized "your" made it clear she didn't consider this money ours. When I suggested James and I should discuss household budgets, Margaret's fork paused mid-air. "Oh, Harper," she laughed without warmth. "James has more pressing concerns than domestic trivialities now. He's a professional man with a serious career. Perhaps you should consider contributing more meaningfully yourself." The words hit like slaps. James said nothing. Just continued eating whilst avoiding my gaze. This conversation had been planned. Margaret hadn't come to celebrate. She'd come to put me in my place. "I see," I said quietly. "And what exactly did you have in mind?" Margaret's eyes gleamed. "Well, you could start by being more supportive. Less demanding. James shouldn't have to worry about household expenses when he's working so hard." "Household expenses like food? Electricity? The mortgage? Don't be difficult, Harper. You know what I mean." I looked at James, waiting for him to defend me. To remember that this was supposed to be our celebration, our future. Instead, he reached for his wine. "Margaret's got a point," he said finally. "Things need to change now." Something cracked inside me. Not broke entirely, but definitely fractured. "Change how, exactly?" James finally met my eyes. "You could quit that little job at the charity shop. Focus on what really matters." That little job. 3 years of helping elderly customers, organizing fundraising events, being trusted with responsibility. Reduced to nothing by the man who once called my compassion one of my finest qualities. "And what exactly matters, James?" Margaret leaned forward, sensing victory. "Creating a proper home for a successful man, obviously. James needs support, not another source of stress." I set down my fork carefully. "I see. So I should become your unpaid housekeeper." "Don't be dramatic," James snapped. "We're talking about being a proper wife." The conversation continued around me, but I'd stopped listening. I watched my husband and his mother carve up my future like they were dividing the shepherd's pie. My job, my independence, my sense of self, all dismissed as inconveniences to James's brilliant career. When they finished eating, Margaret stood with satisfaction. "Well, that's settled then. I'll help you transition properly, Harper. We'll start tomorrow." After she left, James tried to kiss my cheek. I pulled away. "Don't," I said quietly. "Harper, be reasonable. This is good for both of us." I looked at him, really looked, and realized I was staring at a stranger. "No, James. This is good for you." As I cleared the table, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The silence that followed Margaret's words stretched like a wire about to snap. I waited for James to say something, anything, to defend our marriage or at least acknowledge that we were supposed to be partners. Instead, he reached for his wine and took a long, deliberate sip. "Margaret's right, Harper," he said finally, still avoiding my eyes. "Things need to change now that I'm earning proper money." I felt something inside me turn cold. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Margaret leaned forward, sensing victory. "Well, darling, it's quite obvious really. James works tremendously hard at a demanding position. When he comes home, he shouldn't have to worry about mundane household matters." The word mundane hit like a slap. I looked around our small dining room, the wedding photos on the sideboard, the shared books on the shelves, the life we'd supposedly built together. Had it all been an illusion? "I see," I said quietly. "And what about my job at the charity shop?" James cleared his throat. "That's hardly a proper career, is it? More of a hobby, really." "A hobby." 3 years of helping elderly customers find affordable clothes, organizing fundraising events, being trusted with the till and keys. Reduced to a hobby by the man who'd once called my compassion admirable. Margaret nodded approvingly whilst I sat there absorbing the casual cruelty of their dismissal. My work, which had sustained us through James's unemployment, was now inconvenient to their grand plans. "Of course," Margaret continued, "there'll need to be adjustments to household arrangements. James requires his own space to work and relax. The spare room would make an excellent study. The spare room. Where I kept my easel and art supplies. Where I painted watercolors on Sunday mornings whilst James lay in bed. My sanctuary was about to become his territory. What about my painting things?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Margaret waved a dismissive hand whilst James continued his intensive study of his dinner plate. My art, which had brought me such joy, was about to join my job in the category of inconvenient obstacles to James's success. Those old bits and pieces? Perhaps the garden shed? Really, Harper, it might be time to put away childish pursuits and focus on being a proper wife. Childish pursuits. I looked at James, hoping to see some flicker of the man who'd encouraged my painting, who'd bought me professional watercolors for our first anniversary. He was studying his plate as though it contained state secrets. "That sounds sensible," he said without looking up. "We need to be practical now." I excused myself to fetch pudding from the kitchen, needing a moment to steady myself against the worktop. Through the window, I could see our neighbor hanging washing in the gathering dusk. A normal Tuesday evening in a normal world, whilst mine quietly imploded. When I returned with the trifle, Margaret was showing James something on her phone. They looked up guiltily as I entered, like children caught planning mischief. "Actually, Harper," Margaret said with saccharine sweetness, "James and I have discussed a wonderful opportunity." "Mrs. Patterson from church?" "Her cleaning ladies given notice." A cleaning job. After everything I'd done to support James through unemployment, after all the sacrifices and encouragement, they wanted me to scrub someone else's toilets. How thoughtful, I managed, serving trifle with hands that only trembled slightly. Margaret continued outlining the position with the enthusiasm of someone describing a marvelous gift. £8 an hour. 4 hours daily. Perfect for someone in my situation, though she didn't elaborate on exactly what my situation was, beyond being an inconvenience to James's career trajectory. The conversation continued around me, but I'd stopped listening properly. I watched my husband and his mother carve up my future like they were dividing the shepherd's pie. My job, my art, my sense of self, all dismissed as obstacles to James's brilliant new life. Margaret had already mentioned me to Mrs. Patterson. Without asking. Without consulting. As if I were a piece of furniture they could loan out at will. As I watched them eat my pudding and plan my future, one thought crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. They thought they were playing chess whilst I played drafts. But they had no idea I'd been studying the board all along. The next morning, I woke to James's alarm at 6:30. He moved about the bedroom with quiet efficiency, trying not to wake me. How considerate. I kept my eyes closed and listened to his morning routine, the whir of his electric toothbrush, the clink of his cufflinks, the soft thud of his briefcase. "I'll be late tonight," he whispered. "Meeting with senior partners about the Henderson account." The front door closed with a gentle click. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, noting the water stain we'd never bothered to fix. Now James could afford proper repairs, but somehow I suspected that stain would remain my responsibility. Margaret had promised to pop round today to help reorganize things properly. The thought of her rifling through my belongings made my stomach turn, but it also sparked something else. A memory I'd forgotten in last night's shock. I made tea and settled at the kitchen table with my laptop. If Margaret wanted to play games with my future, she might discover I wasn't entirely defenseless. There was something rather important that both she and James had overlooked in their eagerness to redesign my life. 3 years ago, when James and I were still giddy newlyweds, we'd made financial arrangements that seemed romantic then. James had been starting his consultancy, full of dreams and grand plans. He'd needed capital, and I'd had my grandmother's inheritance sitting in a building society, earning nothing. "Let's build something together," he'd said, eyes bright with possibility. A proper partnership. So I'd invested. Not just money, but time, ideas, contacts from university where I'd studied business management. When his consultancy failed after 18 months, I'd comforted him. When he'd struggled to find employment, I'd encouraged him to take the Morrison position. What I'd never done was withdraw my name from various legal documents we'd signed during those optimistic days, including the partnership agreement giving me 51% ownership of any intellectual property James developed using my investment. I sipped my tea and opened my laptop, accessing the secure folder with our important documents. There it was, my signature alongside James's on papers that neither Margaret nor my husband had reviewed recently. Papers that made me not just James's wife, but his business partner. A smile tugged at my mouth as I scrolled through contract details. James's position at Morrison hadn't materialized in a vacuum. He'd won the job partly on a marketing proposal that bore striking resemblance to strategies I'd developed during my final year at university. Strategies that, according to our partnership agreement, remained my intellectual property. The irony was delicious. Whilst Margaret plotted to reduce me to housekeeping, she had no idea her precious son's career was built on foundations I'd laid. Foundations that were legally mine. I heard a key in the front door and quickly closed the laptop. Margaret bustled in without knocking, carrying shopping bags and wearing a general's expression. "Good morning, Harper dear," she said, setting bags on my counter. "I've brought storage boxes. I thought we'd start with the spare room today." "How efficient of you," I replied, matching her tone. She began unpacking boxes, chattering about organization and proper filing systems. I watched her preparations with newfound composure, sipping tea and making appropriate sounds. Margaret produced a clipboard from her bags. "I've made a schedule for household reorganization. Today the spare room, tomorrow your wardrobe. Some clothes really aren't suitable for a professional man's wife, and by weekend you'll be ready for Mrs. Patterson." She handed me the clipboard with triumph. I accepted it graciously, scanning her detailed timeline for dismantling my life. Her handwriting was neat, her planning thorough. She'd put considerable thought into my subjugation. "This is very comprehensive," I said. "I do like to be organized," Margaret preened. "James appreciates efficiency, you know." I nodded thoughtfully, still holding her clipboard. The woman who thought she was orchestrating my downfall had no idea what she was actually setting in motion. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." "Have you ever heard the phrase 'be careful what you wish for'?" She looked puzzled. "Well, yes, I suppose." "Why?" Oh, no particular reason, I said, setting down the clipboard and standing. Shall we start on that spare room? As I led her upstairs, I felt lighter than I had in months. Margaret might have her clipboard and storage boxes, but I had something far more valuable. I had the law on my side. Margaret attacked my spare room like a woman possessed. Within an hour, she dismantled my easel and packed my watercolors into a cardboard box labeled Harper's Hobbies in her precise handwriting. Each brush, each tube of paint, each half-finished canvas disappeared into storage with military efficiency. There now, she said, surveying the empty space with satisfaction. Much better. James will need a proper desk here, of course. Something substantial. Executive-looking. I nodded agreeably whilst mentally calculating the cost of the art supplies she'd just dismissed. The easel alone had been £200, a gift from James during happier times. Now it leaned against the garden shed like a forgotten friend. I've ordered a leather desk set from Harrods, Margaret continued. Matching accessories, proper letter openers, the works. James needs to project the right image when he brings work home. Work home. As if our house was transforming into an extension of Morrison and Associates. I wondered if I'd need appointments to see my own husband. Margaret, I said carefully, may I ask how James secured this position? The competition must have been fierce for such a well-paid role. Margaret's face lit up with maternal pride. Oh, James impressed them enormously with his presentation. Something quite innovative about integrated marketing strategies. The senior partners were apparently bowled over by his creative approach. Integrated marketing strategies. My pulse quickened. Those were the exact words from my university dissertation, the paper that had earned me first-class honors. The same concepts I'd discussed with James during countless late-night conversations about business development. How wonderfully creative of him, I managed. Isn't it just? I always knew James had inherited the family's entrepreneurial spirit. His grandfather built quite an empire from nothing, you know. I made appropriate impressed noises whilst my mind raced. If James had used my academic work to secure his position, our partnership agreement gave me legal claim not just to the intellectual property, but potentially to his employment contract itself. Margaret began measuring windows for new curtains, muttering about proper window treatments for a professional space. I excused myself to use the loo, but instead slipped into our bedroom where James kept his briefcase. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside, amongst the usual business detritus, I found a folder marked Morrison Presentation Materials. I opened it carefully, my heart hammering against my ribs. There it was. Page after page of my research, my theories, my innovative approaches to customer engagement. James had lifted entire sections from my dissertation, barely bothering to paraphrase. The presentation that had won him his dream job was built almost entirely on my academic work. I photographed each page with my phone, my anger building with every click. 3 years of marriage, and this was how much my contributions were valued. James had stolen my work to advance his career, and now he and his mother were systematically erasing me from my own life. Harper. Margaret's voice drifted upstairs. What are you doing up there, dear? Just coming, I called back, quickly replacing the folder and closing the briefcase. I found Margaret in the kitchen, making herself tea with the casual familiarity of someone who considered this house her domain. I've been thinking, she said, settling at my kitchen table, about your chat with Mrs. Patterson. Perhaps you should practice your interview technique. James tells me you can be rather awkward in formal situations. Rather awkward. I wondered when my husband had shared that particular character assassination with his mother. What sort of questions might Mrs. Patterson ask? I inquired sweetly. Margaret outlined the interrogation I could expect, discussing my shortcomings as though I weren't present. Previous experience, attention to detail, willingness to work flexible hours. She was quite particular about her standards, but Margaret was sure I'd manage if I applied myself properly. And the salary? I asked. Well, it's not about money, is it? It's about having purpose. Contributing meaningfully. Though I believe she pays around £8 an hour. £8 an hour. Less than I'd earned at the charity shop, doing work that actually mattered to me. Meanwhile, James was earning £12,000 monthly using strategies I'd developed. That does sound purposeful, I said. Margaret beamed as though I were a slow child who'd finally grasped a simple concept. As I watched her sip my tea in my kitchen whilst planning my future as domestic help, something crystallized inside me. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. More calculated. James and Margaret thought they were playing chess whilst I played drafts. They had no idea I'd been studying the board all along. Mrs. Patterson lived in a Georgian terrace that whispered old money from every perfectly maintained brick. Margaret had insisted on accompanying me to the interview, for moral support, though her presence felt more like supervision than solidarity. "Remember," Margaret murmured as we climbed the front steps, "speak clearly, don't fidget, and do emphasize your availability for flexible hours." The woman who answered the door was exactly what I'd expected, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret gushed, "how lovely to see you again. This is Harper, James's wife." James's wife. Not Harper the individual, not Harper with her own qualifications and experience. Just an appendage to my husband's identity. "Come in," Mrs. Patterson said crisply, leading us through to a sitting room that belonged in a magazine spread. "I'll interview Harper alone, if you don't mind, Margaret." Margaret's face fell slightly. "Oh, but I thought. I prefer to conduct these matters privately," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. Once Margaret had been diplomatically exiled to the hallway, Mrs. Patterson settled into a wingback chair and studied me with sharp blue eyes. "Tell me about your previous employment," she began. "I've worked at St. Bartholomew's charity shop for the past 3 years. I managed the till, organized stock, and coordinated fundraising events." "And why are you leaving?" The question I'd dreaded. How to explain that I wasn't leaving by choice, that my husband and his mother had decided my job was beneath the dignity of a successful man's wife? "Family circumstances have changed," I said carefully. "My husband's career is advancing, and we feel it's time for me to focus more on domestic responsibilities." Mrs. Patterson nodded. "And what makes you think you're suitable for domestic work?" "What indeed?" I thought of my art degree, my business qualifications, my years of experience in retail management. None of which apparently qualified me for anything more than scrubbing someone else's floors. "I believe in doing any job thoroughly and with pride," I said. "The position involves 4 hours daily, Monday through Friday. Cleaning, laundry, some meal preparation. £8 per hour. Are you comfortable with those terms?" £32 a day. £160 a week. Less than I'd spent on art supplies in a good month. But I nodded acceptance. "When could you start?" "Monday, if that suits." Mrs. Patterson made a note on her pad. "Very well. I'll expect you at 9 o'clock sharp." The interview was over. I'd just been hired as someone's cleaning lady, a role that would occupy my mornings whilst James sat in meetings discussing marketing strategies I'd developed. Margaret practically vibrated with satisfaction as we walked home. "She liked you. I could tell. This is exactly what you need, Harper. Proper structure, meaningful work." Meaningful work. I almost laughed at the irony. That evening, James arrived home carrying flowers, daffodils from the corner shop, probably purchased as an afterthought. The guilty gesture of a man who knew he'd behaved poorly but wasn't quite ready to admit it. "How did the interview go?" he asked, kissing my cheek with practiced affection. "Very well. I start Monday." "Excellent." His relief was palpable. Margaret said Mrs. Patterson is a wonderful woman to work for. Wonderful for Margaret, perhaps, who wouldn't be the one scrubbing her toilets. "James," I said quietly, "do you remember my university dissertation?" He paused, the flowers halfway to the vase I'd fetched. "Your what?" "My final project. Integrated marketing strategies for small businesses. You used to say it was brilliant." "Oh, that." He resumed arranging the daffodils, not meeting my eyes. "Ancient history now, isn't it?" "Ancient history. Like our marriage, apparently." "Of course," I agreed. "Ancient history." But as I watched him fuss with the flowers, avoiding my gaze, I knew he remembered exactly what I was talking about. He remembered because he'd stolen it, piece by piece, to build his glittering new career. And that knowledge would prove very useful indeed. The daffodils drooped slightly in their vase, already wilting from their journey. Much like my marriage, I supposed. Beautiful once, but past saving now. I smiled at James as he stepped back to admire his handiwork. They're lovely, I said. Absolutely perfect. He had no idea I wasn't talking about the flowers. Monday morning arrived grey and drizzling, much like my mood. I'd spent the weekend watching James transform our spare room into his personal sanctuary, complete with the leather desk set Margaret had ordered. My paintings now resided in the garden shed alongside the lawnmower and bags of compost. You'll do brilliantly, James said over breakfast, spreading marmalade on his toast with infuriating cheerfulness. It'll be good for you to have proper structure again. Proper structure. As opposed to the improper structure of managing a charity shop and pursuing my art. I smiled and poured him more coffee, playing the supportive wife whilst mentally rehearsing various sharp responses. Mrs. Patterson's house felt even grander in daylight. She met me at the tradesman's entrance, a pointed reminder of my new status, and handed me a typed list of daily tasks. I expect these completed to my standards, she said crisply. The cleaning supplies are in the utility room. Lunch is at your own expense, and I prefer minimal conversation during working hours. The utility room was larger than our kitchen at home. Industrial-strength cleaning products lined the shelves like soldiers awaiting orders. I tied on the apron Mrs. Patterson provided and began with the downstairs loo. 4 hours of scrubbing, polishing, and hoovering later, my back ached and my hands were raw from chemical exposure. Mrs. Patterson inspected my work with the thoroughness of a military commander, pointing out 2 missed spots on the bathroom mirror and a streak on the kitchen window. Better tomorrow, she said dismissively, handing me £32 in cash. I walked home slowly, letting the money burn in my pocket. £32 for 4 hours of backbreaking labor. James would earn more than that during his morning coffee break. That evening, I found James in his new study, looking every inch the successful executive behind his impressive desk. He glanced up from his laptop with a patronizing smile. "How was your first day, darling?" "Educational," I replied truthfully. "I'm sure you'll settle in beautifully." Mrs. Patterson called Mother. "Apparently you did quite well for a first day." "Quite well. Like a dog learning to fetch." "James, do you ever think about our early conversations? When we discussed business strategies and marketing concepts?" He frowned slightly. "What brings that up?" "Just reminiscing. You used to value my opinions then." "I still do," he said, though his attention had already returned to his screen. "It's just that things are different now. I'm dealing with rather complex matters at the firm." "Rather complex matters. Built on foundations I'd provided." "Of course they are," I said. "I'll leave you to work." I went to the kitchen and opened my laptop, accessing the photographs I'd taken of James's presentation materials. Each page strengthened my case, but I needed more evidence. I needed proof of the financial arrangements we'd made, the partnership agreements that still bore both our signatures. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Harper, it's Sarah Chen from next door. Saw you looking a bit down today. Fancy a coffee tomorrow? I work from home Tuesdays. X. Sarah Chen." I'd exchanged pleasantries with her over the garden fence but never properly got to know her. She was some sort of freelance consultant, always immaculately dressed and confident in a way I envied. I typed back, "Would love to." "What time?" "After your morning shift." "Say 2 p.m. My morning shift. Even the neighbors knew about my new role. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but typed, "Perfect. See you then." The next morning's cleaning routine felt slightly less humiliating, though Mrs. Patterson's criticism remained constant. When I arrived at Sarah's house that afternoon, she welcomed me with genuine warmth and excellent coffee. "So," she said, settling into her pristine kitchen, "Margaret mentioned you're working for Mrs. Patterson now. How are you finding it?" Direct, but not unkind. I found myself opening up to this near stranger in a way I hadn't with anyone for months. "It's rather different from what I'm used to," I admitted. Sarah studied me carefully. What did you do before? I managed the charity shop on High Street. Before that, I studied business management. And now you're cleaning houses? Sarah's eyebrows rose. That seems like quite a career change. The understatement of the century. My husband's circumstances have improved. We felt it was time for me to focus more on domestic priorities. Sarah's expression suggested she'd heard this sort of explanation before and wasn't buying it. Harper, she said gently, forgive me for being direct, but you look absolutely miserable. What's really going on? Something in her tone, perhaps the simple kindness of being asked, broke through my carefully maintained composure. And for the first time in weeks, I told someone the truth. Sarah listened without interruption as I poured out the whole wretched story. Margaret's manipulations, James's transformation, the systematic dismantling of my identity. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment, processing what she'd heard. My God, Harper, she said finally. What absolute bastards. The casual profanity was somehow more comforting than any gentle sympathy would have been. Here was someone who understood the magnitude of what was happening to me. The worst part, I continued, is that I can see what they're doing, but I feel powerless to stop it. Every day I become smaller, more invisible. Sarah leaned forward. What did you say your degree was in? Business management. First-class honors from Leeds. And James's presentation that got him the job, you think it was based on your work? I know it was. I have photographs of the documents. Sarah's eyes sharpened with interest. Show me. I hesitated. This felt like crossing a line, sharing evidence with someone outside my marriage. But then I thought of James in his leather chair, dismissing my contributions as ancient history. I opened my phone and showed Sarah the photographs. She studied each one carefully, occasionally making small sounds of recognition or disapproval. Harper, this is extraordinary, she said when she'd finished. He's lifted entire sections verbatim from your academic work. I know. But I don't know what to do about it. What do you know about intellectual property law? Not much. Sarah stood up and moved to her kitchen counter, where she opened her own laptop. I do some legal consulting work. May I? She typed rapidly, pulling up various websites and legal documents. After several minutes, she turned the screen towards me. If this work was yours originally, and if there are legal agreements in place giving you partnership rights, you may have grounds for a claim against both James and his employer. My heart began to race. What sort of claim? Copyright infringement, breach of partnership agreement, potentially even fraudulent misrepresentation if he used your work to secure employment under false pretenses. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. But he's my husband. So was mine, Sarah said quietly. Before he decided my business wasn't important enough to consider in his career plans. I looked at her with new understanding. What happened? I built a consultancy from nothing. 5 years of 18-hour days, sleeping in my office, missing family events. When I finally started earning serious money, David suddenly developed opinions about how I should run things. He wanted to be involved, to help me optimize my approach. Within 6 months, he'd undermined 3 major client relationships and nearly bankrupted me. How did you escape? I didn't escape. I fought back. Used every legal tool available to protect what I'd built. It wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary. Sarah moved to a filing cabinet and pulled out a business card. This is my solicitor, Elena Rodriguez. She specializes in partnership disputes and intellectual property cases. I stared at the card. I couldn't afford a solicitor. Elena offers initial consultations on a contingency basis. If she thinks you have a case, she'll work for a percentage of any settlement. The implications of what Sarah was suggesting slowly sank in. This wasn't just about challenging James's behavior, this was about potentially destroying his career, his future with Morrison and Associates. I don't know if I can do that to him, I said. Sarah's expression hardened slightly. Harper, what exactly do you think he's doing to you? The question hung in the air between us. I thought of my paintings in the garden shed, of Mrs. Patterson's condescending inspection of my work, of £32 for 4 hours of labour whilst James earned a fortune using my ideas. He's stealing my life, I said quietly. Then perhaps it's time you stole it back. I took the card, my fingers trembling slightly. Elena Rodriguez, solicitor. Partnership and intellectual property disputes. One small piece of cardboard that could change everything. There's something else, Sarah said. Something you should know before you decide anything. What? Mrs. Patterson called Margaret this morning. I overheard from the garden. They're planning to increase your hours, reduce your pay. Apparently, you're getting above yourself and need to learn proper humility. The final piece clicked into place. This wasn't just about James's career or Margaret's interference. This was about deliberately crushing whatever remained of my self-worth. I looked down at Elena Rodriguez's business card. What time does she open tomorrow? I asked. Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. 9 o'clock sharp. Elena Rodriguez had the sort of office that inspired confidence, polished wood, leather-bound legal texts, and certificates covering one entire wall. She was younger than I'd expected, with sharp intelligent eyes and an air of barely contained energy. Mrs. Harper, she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. Sarah's told me something of your situation. Shall we start with the partnership agreements? I placed the folder of documents on her desk, my hand steadier than I'd expected. Elena studied each page carefully, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. After 20 minutes, she sat back with a satisfied expression. This is quite straightforward, actually. The partnership agreement clearly states your ownership of any intellectual property developed during the marriage, particularly anything derived from your academic work or business concepts. And James's employment at Morrison and Associates. If he obtained that position using your copyrighted material without disclosure, both he and the firm could face serious consequences. Copyright infringement, fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty. The legal terminology felt like a foreign language, but Elena's confidence was infectious. What would you recommend? I asked. We have several options. We could approach Morrison and Associates directly, demanding they investigate how their new employee obtained his presentation materials. Or we could file a formal complaint with the Intellectual Property Office. The nuclear option would be a full civil suit for damages and injunctive relief. Nuclear option. The phrase sent shivers down my spine. What would happen to James? Elena's expression softened slightly. Mrs. Harper, I understand this is difficult. But James made a deliberate choice to steal your work and pass it off as his own. The consequences of that choice aren't your responsibility. I thought of James arranging daffodils in our kitchen, avoiding my eyes when I mentioned my dissertation. He'd known exactly what he was doing. How long do I have to decide? The sooner we act, the stronger our position. Copyright cases become more complicated with time. I thanked Elena and walked home in a daze, her business card burning in my pocket like evidence of planned betrayal. The house was empty when I arrived, James at work, Margaret presumably planning my next humiliation somewhere. I found myself in James's study, staring at his expensive desk set. On the leather blotter lay a printed email from Morrison and Associates. I shouldn't have read it, but my eyes caught the subject line, Henderson Account, Quarterly Review. The email praised James's innovative approach to the Henderson campaign and mentioned a substantial bonus for exceeding client expectations. A bonus earned using strategies I'd developed. That evening, James arrived home in celebratory mood, carrying champagne and wearing the expression of a man who'd conquered the world. Wonderful news, darling, he announced, kissing my cheek. The Henderson campaign's been such a success that Morrison's offering me a partnership track position. Can you believe it? Partnership. Built on my stolen work. How marvelous, I said. You must be terribly pleased. I am indeed. And there'll be a significant salary increase, of course. We'll finally be able to afford that house in Hampstead we looked at. As if I'd be part of this bright future rather than relegated to cleaning other people's houses. James, I said carefully, before we celebrate, there's something we need to discuss. He was wrestling with the champagne cork and barely looked up. What's that? Your presentation materials. The ones you used to get this job. His hands stilled on the bottle. What about them? I think you know what about them. Slowly, James set down the champagne and turned to face me. For the first time in months, I had his complete attention. Harper, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you that I know you used my university work for your presentation. My research, my theories, my intellectual property. The color drained from his face. That's absurd. I have photographs of the documents, James. Side-by-side comparisons with my original dissertation. Would you like to see them? He sat down heavily in the nearest chair. How did you? Does it matter how? The question is what we're going to do about it. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the growing chasm of our marriage. Finally, James spoke. What do you want? It was the first honest question he'd asked me in months. I want my life back, I said. All of it. And for the first time since that terrible dinner with Margaret, I meant every word. 6 months later, I stood in the mahogany-paneled conference room at Morrison & Associates, watching James clear out his desk through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The partners had been swift once Elena presented our evidence. Copyright theft, breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation, the legal terms had fallen like dominoes, each one sealing James's fate. Mrs. Harper, Mr. Morrison himself had said during our final meeting, "We're appalled by Mr. Whitfield's deception. Your original work was genuinely brilliant. We'd be honored to discuss a consulting arrangement with you directly." Me. Not James. Not the man who'd stolen my ideas and dismissed my contributions as ancient history. The irony was exquisite. I'd kept the house, of course. Our prenuptial agreement, hastily signed by a lovesick James who'd never bothered to read the fine print, had protected my inheritance admirably. The same money that had funded his failed consultancy and, ultimately, his successful theft. Margaret had stopped speaking to me entirely after the legal proceedings began. She'd moved to Brighton, apparently, to live with her sister. I'd heard she'd taken to describing me as that dreadful woman who destroyed poor James to anyone who'd listen. Poor James, who was now working as a junior marketing assistant at a firm in Croydon, earning a fraction of what Morrison's had paid him. Mrs. Patterson had been rather less understanding about my sudden departure from domestic service. Most unreliable, she'd sniffed when I'd given my notice. I'd resisted the urge to tell her exactly where she could file her disapproval. This morning, I'd signed the contracts making me Harper Consulting's first official client. My new office overlooked the Thames, with space for both my business operations and my art studio. The easel I'd retrieved from the garden shed now stood by the window, catching the morning light perfectly. Sarah had become my closest friend and business partner. Her experience with partnership disputes had proved invaluable, and she'd introduced me to a network of women who'd fought similar battles against dismissive husbands and won. Revenge, she'd told me over coffee last week, is a dish best served with proper legal documentation. Luna stretched luxuriously in the patch of sunlight on my new office carpet, completely unconcerned with human dramas. She'd adapted to our changed circumstances with typical feline pragmatism, though she did seem rather pleased to have reclaimed her position as the most important female in my life. James had tried calling several times in recent weeks. I'd let each call go to voicemail, listening to his increasingly desperate attempts at reconciliation with detached interest. He'd spoken of misunderstandings, of pressures from his mother, of love that remained unchanged despite everything. Love. As if love could exist alongside theft, manipulation, and systematic humiliation. This morning's voicemail had been different. Quieter. More honest, perhaps. Harper, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know I understand now what I did to you. What we did to you. I was weak and selfish and I threw away the best thing in my life for nothing, really. I hope you're happy. I hope you're painting again. I hope you remember that there was good between us once, even if I destroyed it all. There had been good between us once. But that James, the one who'd encouraged my art and valued my opinions, had been revealed as either an illusion or a casualty of his own ambitions. Either way, he was gone. I deleted the message without saving it. My new life was waiting, bright with possibility and built on foundations that belonged to me alone. I'd learned, painfully but thoroughly, that the only person responsible for my happiness was myself. The morning sun streamed through my office windows, illuminating the blank canvas on my easel. So much potential, so many choices, all of them mine to make. I picked up my brush and began to paint my future.